Oxymorons. Are you guys familiar with oxymorons? Two different concepts that we say together, but they don't seem to make sense. Like clean dirt. You ever seen a sign for clean dirt or jumbo shrimp? Military intelligence, that kind of stuff, yeah. You wonder about these things because they're contradictory ideas, and how can contradictory ideas work? In movies, when we watch movies, we sometimes see these contradictory ideas, right? As a matter of fact, there's a whole subgroup of folks who love to do nothing more than to go on the internet and show up the mistakes in films. So, by the way, just as Randy was nice enough to say, yeah, these are all the different ways you can keep in touch with me. I'm sure there's more, but those are some of my primary channels, and you can watch different videos and things like that. And I'll give you that again. One of the most beloved movies and one of the more popular films to ever be shown in theaters is E.T. the Extraterrestrial by Steven Spielberg. How many of you have seen E.T. the Extraterrestrial? Okay, yeah. Do you remember this scene? This is the scene where the clandestine government agency that nobody ever names, the secret agency that's hunting this extraterrestrial, drives 30 trucks in procession right down the street of a suburb and sets up these huge tents. Now, I don't know how you keep a clandestine organization clandestine when you have a parade. I've wondered that. But this is what I'm talking about. When you start seeing some of these things and you have, or this scene, here's the famous scene, right? You guys remember they're chasing E.T. in the middle of the film, and he's with Elliot and all this, and these kids are all on bikes. They don't know what they're going to do, but somehow E.T. has the power to levitate, and the bikes fly, and that even becomes Steven Spielberg's, signature vanity card, the bicycle over the moon. Well, my question was at the very beginning of the film when E.T. was running from the soldiers, how come he didn't levitate then? It's like, so these are the kinds of things that you start to wonder. You go, well, maybe the writers, obviously they're doing this stuff for the story. But when you get into real belief systems, finding these kinds of contradictions are huge red flags. Then you start to say maybe your point of view, your position, your belief system doesn't work, because when you have a contradiction, it shows that there's a flaw. They can't both be right at the same time. So this is how we test beliefs, right? How do you test a belief? We know a belief isn't true if it can hold two contradictory statements simultaneously. Okay? If it rains, the grass will be wet. It rained, and the grass is not wet. Well, you can't believe both of those if you hold them at the same time in meaning in the same way. So, for example, I want all of you to try to obey this sign. That's pretty tough to do, isn't it? You have to know what the sign says in order to obey it. But as soon as you know what the sign says, you've disobeyed it. This is what I mean by contradictory beliefs. 1 Thessalonians gives us our anchor verse here. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstance, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the Spirit. Do not despise prophecies. Underline this part. But test everything. Hold fast to what is good. Think about how amazing Christianity is. That those proponents of Christianity said, you should test it. We aren't even above reproach. Test your beliefs. Test the guys who are telling you what I believe. Test the guys who are telling you what I don't believe. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at what modern atheism, what positions they take, and we're going to see how their beliefs stand up. Now, if you want me to talk about testing Christianity and how Christian beliefs stand up, I can do that. But right now, I was asked to do this talk. Maybe we'll come back and do another one later. Okay, first thing about God. You have the moral problem. As I talked about last night, good and evil are not objective things. They're simply the shared preferences, right, of individual cultures, and they can change from culture to culture. This is what most atheists hold. Unless, of course, one is talking about the God of the Bible, then he's objectively evil. You see the problem here. And I'm going to use Richard Dawkins in his very famous book, The God Delusion, as an example. He said, quote, "The God of the Old Testament is one of the arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pesticidal, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Yeah, I keep hearing Hamlet say, "Methink you doth protest too much." But here's the problem with this. By what yardstick is Richard Dawkins judging God? If good and evil are not objective, but simply shared preferences among individual cultures, and the ancient Israelites were a culture who shared specific preferences, then how can Dawkins say the ancient Israelites and their precepts that they said were from God are wrong? It becomes a problem, doesn't it? You see the issue. Dawkins wants to wipe God out, but in trying to wipe God out, what does he do? He establishes that there's at least a moral groundwork, a moral framework, like C.S. Lewis said last night. How can I know what crooked is unless I know what straight is? How can I know what right and wrong is? Look, it's like this. Say I go out onto the road right here, and I watch cars driving by, and I say, you know what? I think those cars are driving far too fast. Here's what I'm going to do. Anytime I see anybody going 30 miles an hour, I'm going to run out in the street, flag the car down, and I'm going to write them a ticket myself. Now, if you were driving down the street and you see some guy coming out of the bushes like me, waving you down, handing you a piece of paper with a handwritten ticket on it, what would you do? You'd say, "This is ridiculous. What are you doing? I'm not going to." Who are you to tell me that I'm driving too fast? You know, there's a speed limit sign here. We'll obey the speed limit sign. Why does the speed limit sign? Now, if I'm a police officer, it's a different story, isn't it? Why? Because the law that has been established comes from an authoritative source, a source higher than me. First of all, we establish that there is a law. We all understand that there is a speed limit. So when you start writing out tickets, you're actually saying that there is something that you violated. Any moral law says there's something that you violated. There is a right and a wrong. So when Dawkins complains that God is unjust, he's actually admitting that there is a right and a wrong way to approach things. But if there's a right and a wrong, that means a good and an evil. That means that there has to be some kind of law to compare. Just like if we're talking about speeding, you have to have a law that says this is too fast and this is not. If you're driving on the German Autobahn, there is no speed limit. You can't get a ticket for going 100 miles an hour, 120 miles an hour. There's maybe suggestions, but there's no law. So you're not violating the law by going too fast there if no speed limit exists. There has to be a law so you know when you're violating it. So if you're admitting that there is a right and a wrong, you're admitting that there's a moral law behind it. But guess what laws require? Laws require lawgivers, don't they? In other words, I can't just go out and write you a ticket. You have to have a city council or somebody create a law that says in our city, you can only drive a maximum of 35 miles an hour in business streets and 25 miles an hour in residential zones. And the city council approves this because they have the authority to do so. We've given them that authority through our elections. And now it becomes law. So we have a right and wrong because we have a lawgiver, and that lawgiver has certain authority. With the moral law, it works the same way. If there's a right and a wrong, a way to do things, that right and a wrong implies a moral law. But that moral law implies a moral lawgiver. And by the way, that moral lawgiver can't come from humanity itself, because all of humanity is subject to that law. So you have to have a lawgiver who not only stands outside of humanity, but has the authority above humanity. Now, who would have the authority above humanity but the creator of humanity? He is the only one that could exercise any authority over all of humanity. So, if there's a right and a wrong, if there's a good and an evil, then there's a moral law. If there's a moral law, there's a moral lawgiver. If there's a moral lawgiver, that means that there's somebody who stands with authority over all of humanity, through whom we can understand the ultimate good. It's God. It's like the definition of what God is. Someone who's the creator, to whom we must answer, and to whom good and evil are judged by. So when Richard Dawkins complains about the God of the Old Testament, when he says there is no God because of all these negative things, guess what happens? He's saying you're implying that there is no moral law, but that means there would be no moral lawgiver. But if there's no moral lawgiver, then you can't complain that God is bad or good. As soon as you complain God is bad or good, you're assuming a moral law, you're assuming a moral lawgiver, then you're assuming God exists. You're just confused in exactly what you say. And just as I mentioned last night, and I won't go through these today, the problem with these things is the idea that if morality cannot come from a non-existent God, if it comes from societies, then things like slavery, infanticide, things like that become okay. And the ancient Romans did practice infanticide. They would abandon their children by the side of the Tiber if they didn't want them. And again, you don't have organizations or societies progress morally. Societies don't get better, they just change. It's just different flavors of ice cream. So that's what we see. I had a conversation on campus with a girl who was an atheist. This is when I take students to UC Berkeley and do these things. And I asked her, we started asking her, do you believe in God or a higher power? No. Do you believe that there's such a thing as an absolute morality? No. And I said, so everything that everybody does is right for them? Is that what you're saying? She says, yes. And I'm curious now. I say, really? In all circumstances? She goes, yeah. I mean, ultimately, there is no real, at least she's consistent, right, in her atheism. So there's no right and wrong at all. I said, well, let me ask you a question. What about if a guy comes up, and her sister was standing with her while I was talking about this. What about if a guy comes up and says, just grabs your sister and says, I'm going to rape her. I feel this need. This is right for me to do right now, and I'm going to rape her. Are you going to tell me that that's still not wrong? That's still not intrinsically wrong? And she said, well, if he really believed it, I guess it wouldn't be wrong. Now, her sister went, I don't blame her, right? And you may get this when you talk to people. Here's the problem. When you start talking about these beliefs, they abstract them. They justify them by making them something different than real life. And what I did was I had to answer, and I had to look her in the eye. I said, you know what? You're lying to me right now. What you're trying to do is to save face to win your argument. But let me tell you, if a real person came up right now and snatched your sister, you wouldn't even bother asking if he really believed it or not. You'd be the first one shouting for the police. And this is the problem. If you ever want to find out how to get through to a person whose moral relativism is claiming moral relativism, is you just relativize whatever the thing is that they're passionate about. So you can ask a woman, and I've had conversation. One woman, we talked about it, and then we talked and found out that pedophilia was a thing for her. Abusing children was a problem, and she felt really poorly for those poor kids. So are pedophiles then not objectively wrong? It's like, oh no, well maybe that's objectively wrong, but everything else, well, at least we can establish there's something. And this is what you find out. Here's what you do. If you're ever talking to somebody and they say there's no absolute right and wrong, you say, can I try something with you? Do you have any money in your wallet? Let me see how much you have. Let's just get a number out there. And he comes and he pulls out his wallet and he goes, I got $22 right here. And then you grab it from him and you put it in your pocket and you start to walk away. See, what are you doing? You go, well, this is right for me. I need the money. All of a sudden, his moral relativism will fade away because the reality is taking all of his money bothers him a lot. And that's the problem. So the idea that God can be evil and yet not exist is contradictory. These are the problems with moral relativism. And as I talked about yesterday, like I said, I don't want to go through these again because I mentioned them yesterday. If there are no absolutes to stand upon, everything is viewed by what society says is right now, and then in fighting for improving things. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, conflicting beliefs about science. You guys are all strapped in, right? I don't want to get too deep in the woods on this, but we're going to do a little bit of technical stuff here, but it should be fun. Okay. Science, the atheist says, informs our views. Science is a field of study centered in experimentation and observation, and science dictates that life came from non-living material, the atheist will tell you. Even though in the entire history of mankind, no one has ever once observed life coming from non-life. You see the problem here? If science is done through experiment and observation, and we don't have any observation for the claim that life comes from non-life, then how is that claim science? And this is the problem that we see with what we call the leap to life, abiogenesis. There's a lot of work that's being done in the area of where did we come from. And while we can talk about evolution, and we may, one of the things that you have to know is the biggest problem that the evolutionary biologists and the other folks are having is how life gets kickstarted in the first place. Now, when you start doing these things, we understand, here's the story. The story is that there were basic chemical compounds and they exist in nature, and we see these kinds of things. There's chemicals in pools and ponds, and all, life can be reduced to chemistry if you so desire. So these basic chemical compounds exist in some kind of a primordial soup, normally it's told. And then there's an energy source, either a thermal duct, lightning, volcanoes, ultraviolet radiation, whatever. Some kind of energy source combines with the chemicals and causes some kind of a chemical reaction, and products of chemical reactions will produce the very basic building blocks of life. So acids, nucleotides, maybe, certain things like this. And they can do this in the lab to some degree. They've done this. There's the Miller-Urey experiment, did this kind of thing, manipulated things in order to get some of these basic building blocks. The problem becomes when you go from step 3 to step 4. Acids and nucleotides then link up to form chains of polypeptides, polynucleotides, which is DNA, is one of those, that have the ability to self-replicate. Okay. So the DNA now self-replicate. Then these nucleotides are gathered together in what they call microspheres and blastospheres. Basically, they become cells. They're not just free-floating chains of chemicals. Now they encase themselves so that when they multiply, they can stick together. And then those cells reproduce, and then evolution kicks in. Natural selection favors those best suited for the environment. That's the story. The problem that no one has been able to solve, not even to the point of a working theory, is between 3 and 4. It's a huge gulf, and nobody has the slightest clue as to how you get nucleotides linking up into self-replicating DNA molecules from these basic building blocks. It's kind of like your son has thrown a bunch of Legos over his floor, and they're supposed to come together and form the Death Star from Star Wars. You know, that kind of a thing. It's a big deal. That line right there is a huge dividing point that evolutionary biologists have not been able to solve. You probably have heard of the Miller-Urey experiment if you're at all interested in science, where these guys supposedly went into the lab and created the building blocks of life. Well, what happened was the way they got that number 3 point, those basic building blocks, they started with hydrogen cyanide, water, methane, and ammonia. They sent an electrical charge through the system. As it recyclated, they walked away. In a week, they came back and they found several amino acids. The chemicals had built proteins, and they were all collected at the bottom of the flask there. The problems, though, even with the Miller-Urey experiment, is we believe that the atmosphere is probably not what they originally had modeled. It's probably rich in carbon dioxide and maybe some oxygen, but there's no methane. If you put methane in the system in a real world scenario, the whole thing breaks apart. And then it's like I said, even if you get these building blocks, how do you put them together? How do they just fall together? DNA is a very, very complex molecule. It's an error-correcting code, but it's also very precise. So there's a thing called chirality, and again, I don't want to get too technical, but molecules are handed. Some certain proteins and sugars and things are handed. They have mirror images of each other, right? And they can bond to a sugar backbone easily as well. So for example, in nature, we see right-handed molecules and left-handed molecules in equal numbers usually. Amino acids work both ways. But if you're for nucleotides, you can only use right-handed nucleotides for life. So if you use left-handed ones, they still life. But they're 50-50 in the environment. So one of the things that they're saying is when these building blocks come together, you have to skip every other one. It has to know only the right-handed, not the left-handed, even though each one of these Legos could click onto the base as easily as the others. That's a pretty big coincidence, wouldn't you think? Similarly, when you're talking about amino acids, it's only the left-handed amino acids that are viable for life in proteins. And again, these can be 50-50, yet what we're seeing is, imagine dealing 50, right? You're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of chains of nucleotides. So imagine a deck of cards, several hundred long, and saying, we're going to just deal 200 cards at random. Oh, but by the way, they can only be the black cards. Any of the red cards will kill you. Wow, what a coincidence. I just happened to get 250 black cards in a row. It's nature. No, you wouldn't believe that. That's what they're trying to say. See, it becomes chicken and the egg chemistry, and that's what we're talking about. David Berlinski, who is not a Christian believer, he's an agnostic, but he starts talking about the problem that we face when we start talking about the origin of life. DNA, in order to function, requires enzymes to read it, to unzip it, to replicate it, and to turn the instructions in the DNA molecule into proteins that do stuff in your cells. So you need to have an enzyme, basically a decoder. These enzymes are decoders that will read the DNA. Then you have other enzymes that put together the protein that's required to heal the cell or build an eye or whatever the case is that DNA instruction tells you to do. And then you have other enzymes that will open the DNA up and close it back up and send it off and do all this kind of stuff. But in order to get the proteins and the enzymes, you have to have the DNA say to build it. So what we get is what we call a chicken and the egg scenario. How do we know which came first? And this is what David Berlinski says. He says, if you need enzymes to promote DNA so the DNA can do something, yet you can't have DNA, you can't have enzymes without DNA saying, here's how to build an enzyme, you've got a big problem. You can see how that works. And one of the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA, cytosine, there are 4 primaries, is nowhere to be found in nature at all. That's one that doesn't exist in the natural world. Matter of fact, Berlinski says, quote, not a trace of the stuff has been found in any meteor, fossil, frozen in the Antarctic. It can't be produced by any experiment in prebiotic chemistry. He says, quote, beyond the living cell, it has not been found at all. So where did the cytosine come from? You see the problems, the huge monumental problems that the atheist has in saying life sprang from non-life. Another problem, one that's maybe a little bit more simple, is the one that Louis Pasteur dealt with. You guys all buy pasteurized milk, right? Everybody knows Louis Pasteur because he figured out a way to keep milk from spoiling so fast. Well, Pasteur was working on a problem in his day where people believed that life could spring into existence from dead things, just miraculously. They thought fleas grew out of the dust, or that maggots just happened to appear from dead fish, things like that. One of the things that Pasteur did when he investigated was to show, no, these things are not coming into existence out of nothing or out of dead things. What they're doing is they're coming into existence out of things that are very, very small. That bacteria, for example, will cause yeast to grow, which will spoil your milk. Or fleas are actually coming from flea eggs. Just because you can't see the flea eggs or the flea eggs were laid in the dust doesn't mean that the fleas come from nothing. So what he would do is he would take things like a dead fish and he would heat it up, superheat it, to kill off anything that might be living on the fish. And then he'd sat by, okay, let's watch now and see if new life springs from nothing. And if the container was properly sealed and properly heated, we would never get life from non-life. Life always comes from life. This comes into the idea of biogenesis. Omne vivum ex vivo. All life comes from life. And that was the reigning scientific paradigm until the atheists want to chase God out of the picture. But that's the experimental data, not that life comes from non-life. Now, life can't come from nothing, but what about the universe? This is another statement that atheists tend to hold. The universe came into existence from nothing. And that nothing is made up of at least 2 things, quantum fluctuations and time. And this is usually what happens. See, there is a very famous argument for the existence of God that's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And that argument states, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. Now this to me is elementary. If you're a parent and you see crayon marks on the wall, you say, Johnny, Janie, come in here. Why? Where did these crayon marks come from? And what will your kids tell you? I don't know. They just appeared. And you being a good atheist said, of course, I should have known that. No, you wouldn't believe that. You don't buy that from your kids. You say, right, these don't just come from nowhere. Someone had to put them there. It was a cause because yesterday they weren't there, today they are. They began to exist, therefore there's a cause for their existence. The universe began to exist. We know that. Even the atheist admits the universe began to exist. Now, there may be people who argue about time and how long ago it was. Let me just tell you as a public service announcement, when you're talking with atheists, don't argue about the age of the universe because it's not the important point. Even if the universe is 13.7 billion years old, doesn't mean that God didn't do it. Okay? Even the idea of a Big Bang says that the universe came into existence at least at some point in the past. And just like the crayon marks on the wall, as long as the universe came into existence, as long as we can agree upon that. See, most people are not schooled enough to be able to discuss age of the universe, radiometric dating methods, star light, speed of light, all that stuff. It's way too technical a field. But everybody can talk about if something wasn't there and then it was there, I'm smart enough to know that something caused the thing to come into existence. And that's why you want to focus on that. So, modern physics is perfectly happy with the idea of creation ex nihilo, meaning that things began at zero energy. This comes from the University of Portland. And it says the universe had negative energy, that becomes dark energy, and positive energy will become matter. The sum equals zero, they say. This is not a statement on a cause behind the origin of the universe, nor is it a statement on the lack of purpose or destiny. It's simply a statement that the universe was emergent, that the actual universe probably derived indeterminacy of potentiality that we call the quantum vacuum, whose properties may always be beyond our understanding. Out of nothing, nothing comes. And this is why you have to ask why there is something rather than nothing. See, I'm behind on my slides. I can see that right now. There's your column. Whatever began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. But that nothing, that universe, we know, is made up of at least four things, right? When we talk about the universe, we talk about all matter, all energy, all space, and all time. Matter, energy, space, and time. That's what we talk about when we say the universe is coming into existence. When we talk about something like the quantum vacuum, people say, well, the quantum vacuum cannot be perceived or measured directly since it appears to be empty, but it is in fact filled with potentiality. And this is how they describe it. Within the quantum vacuum, pairs of virtual matter and antimatter particles are continually created and destroyed, borrowing their mass energy by the uncertainty principle. They do not exist as observable entities, but their existence is exerted on other particles as a subtle pressure, called the Casimir effect. Okay, now, think about this with me. If what we're talking about is the creation of the universe, and you're saying the creation of the universe has its cause in this quantum vacuum, which Lawrence Krauss and others define as nothing, that quantum vacuum, in order to exist, has to have a couple of things. It has to have particles of matter and antimatter. It has to have mass and energy or energy, and those are, Einstein's equation says that they can be traded, so let's just say energy. The particles have to have some kind of energy, and because they're created and destroyed, there has to be time, right? You can't, if things are locked, frozen in time, they're neither created nor destroyed, they're stopped right and dead in their tracks. So you have mass, energy, time. Wow, it sounds like the universe is already existing for a quantum vacuum to exist. We're not talking nothing anymore. Quantum vacuum does not solve the problem of where the universe came from, because the universe, you have to account where did the mass come from, where did the energy come from, where did time itself come from? If you have to have time in order to create the universe, but the universe is itself, it's like saying, I want to play football, I want to mark off the goal lines on a football field, but I don't have the field yet. Well, how can you mark off the goal lines on a football field if you don't have a football field? It doesn't make any sense. This is what their atheists are trying to say. As I noted, the universe came into existence from nothing, and that nothing is made up of at least two things: quantum fluctuations and time. It's not nothing, and it becomes a contradiction. So, there's energy in quantum fluctuations, just zero net energy. There's time. Things are coming together and breaking apart. And like he says, it is no means a simple empty space. And again, he says that it's mistaken to think of any physical vacuum as some absolute empty void. These are the problems with quantum fluctuations. But if we continue on with science and we talk about evolution, there's another problem that atheists hold. Because the atheist will tell you that all human beings, even atheists, are of equal worth and should be treated as such, even though we became human through survival of the fittest. Now, how does this work out? How do these two things hold together? I think Dr. Fernandez did a wonderful job talking about the whole concept of evolution and the push towards the Superman. And this is one of the things that we say. What is the one thing that makes everyone equal? Have you ever asked yourself that? Now, think about this for a minute. I am not, if we're just talking about physical, material presentation of myself, I am not equal with other people. There are people who are taller than me. That's a shock, I know. They actually had to lower the platform so that the camera could get my face. I am part of the Zacchaeus Club, yes. My feet sometimes do still swing at the dinner table. I'm one of those guys. I tell people, I used to play basketball, had to give it up, kept hitting my head on the rim. It was ugly. No, that's not true. But there are people who are taller. There are people who are stronger than me. There are people who are smarter than me. There are people who are more successful than me. There are people who are prettier than me. There are people who are just flat better than me. Aren't they more fit than I am? Well, but you're all equal. Well, why? What makes everyone equal? It isn't anything that we've developed out of an evolutionary paradigm. Because if that were true, then the smartest people would be the ones that you'd want to promote, right? And this is what happened in the early 20th century with the eugenics movement, when the United States Supreme Court, among others, said it was okay to sterilize those people of low IQ because we don't want them diluting the gene pool. Buck versus Bell, 1924, Oliver Wendell Holmes made the decision saying against Carrie Buck, who the state had forcibly sterilized her so that she wouldn't give birth to any more children. Although her mother was probably a drunkard and she was probably abused, she probably didn't have true mental deficiency. She was just probably highly abused. Holmes made the famous statement, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, cut her tubes. By the way, that went on, the last state to do forcible eugenics. I think it happened in 1974. It wasn't that long ago. The United States and Germany were the two countries that ran with this idea to say, if evolution's true, sterilize those who are unfit because we want the next race to come up. So you have this statement here, which is one of the statements of human rights from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. James Nichol writes, human rights are universal. All living humans, and he qualifies it, or perhaps all living persons, have human rights. One does not have a particular kind of person or a member of some specific nation or religion to have human rights. Included in the idea of universality is some conception of independent existence. People have human rights independently of whether they are found in the practices, morality, or laws of their country or culture. And he says, secondly, the human right to freedom of movement may be taken away temporarily. So you can jail somebody. It doesn't mean that you don't have human rights. The state sometimes has a compelling right to detain you or something like that. That's what human rights is. But where do you get this on an evolutionary paradigm? If survival of the fittest is the way we go, then eugenics is probably the right thing. Then maybe Aristotle is right. Aristotle reasoned, saying there are people who are born with different levels of smarts, some of which, the smartest guys, should be destined to be kings, philosopher kings. Others, he said, really, they're not that smart. They should be slaves. That's their lot in life. They should serve us. And this was Aristotle. He, through deductive reasoning at only looking at humanity, he came to the same conclusion as a Hitler, as the slave trade, and justified his position based on the fact that people aren't equal. It is only the fact that Genesis 1 tells us God created man and woman in his image, and each of us bears God's image. It is only something supernatural. See, the only thing that we all share in equal measure and an equal value is the fact that we reflect God's image, that we are creatures that share certain attributes of God. And we have the ability to reason. We have the ability to understand beauty. We have the ability to understand spiritual beings outside of ourselves. We have the ability to truly love, selfless love, something that only human beings can truly do. That's what makes us equal. That's what makes us equal. It is not, if we act on those, that's a different story, but we have the ability to so do. And it's a problem for the atheist. He has no way to justify or ground the idea that we're all created equal, even though he wants to hold it. Okay, a couple of last ones. Number one, conflicting beliefs about faith. What do I mean by that? Well, you have different guys holding to different things. So religions versus scientific theories. Here's one. The fact that divergent religious claims try to explain the existence of the cosmos, the atheist, like Sam Harris, will tell you, prove that all religions are false, right? Have you heard this? You know, you say God did it, Muslims say Allah did it, the Buddhists say it was, the karma of the universe, right? So obviously you're all wrong. I just believe in one less God than you, is the popular meme. While the fact that there are divergent scientific theories seeking to explain the existence of the cosmos is how knowledge is acquired and is necessary to eventually arrive at the right conclusion. We like discussion and debate, the fact that people can't agree on things because we understand that that's how science works. Competing hypotheses and the best one wins. Okay? Now let me give you an example. Sam Harris wrote a book, Letter to a Christian Nation, and he says, quote, Christian, why don't you lose any sleep over whether to convert to Islam? Can you prove that Allah is not the one true God? Can you prove that the archangel Gabriel did not visit Muhammad in his cave? Of course not. But you need not prove any of these things to reject the beliefs of Muslims as absurd. Understand that the way you view Islam is precisely the way atheists view Christianity, and in fact, the way we view all other religions. So what is he saying? He's saying, we just believe in one less God than you. Well, but that doesn't make it true or false. Maybe there are good reasons to believe in Christianity. Let me give you an aside. Do you believe that penicillin can cure your infection for the most part, if you haven't developed an antibody to it, or that aspirin can remove your headache? Now, we hold to these things. We believe them. Did we have to try every other remedy before we got to that belief? Did we have to go to an African shaman? Did we have to meditate on a Tibetan hilltop? Did we have to seek out the medicine doctor of a Native American before we could come to the conclusion, oh no, it's penicillin that's the thing that's going to take away my infection? We don't have to try all those other things. If we find the truth, and it is the truth that penicillin does, right? We have good evidence through experiment and through personal experience that penicillin will take away my infection. We don't even need to start down that road. And we are perfectly rational and justified to say, this works. I know it works. I don't even have to try the other stuff. This is the way I'm going to go. Similarly, I don't have to explore Islam in great detail. I don't have to read the Bhagavad Gita in order to know that Christianity is true. I can know Christianity is true because of the evidence of Christianity, just like I can know penicillin can cure my infection because of the test results from penicillin. See, it's self-authenticating in that way. It proves itself. Christianity is based in history. So Harris is wrong here because he doesn't approach medicine that way either. But when it's religion, all of a sudden, it's like, I just believe in one less God than you. Well, yeah. To any math problem, there's millions of wrong answers, but there is one right answer. You can't say that there's no right answer for it. And that's the problem. The idea that divergent religious claims somehow prove all religions are false, while in other instances, divergent scientific claims are a good thing because we're seeking toward the truth. Maybe those other cultures are stumbling, trying to find bits of the truth, but they haven't gotten the truth yet. Maybe that's why we have so many different faiths. Maybe it's because people are just stinking stubborn and they want to believe what they want to believe. Maybe that's, don't tell me to do that. I like to do this, therefore I'm going to develop my faith around it. That could be as well. Lastly, you can ask, are exclusive beliefs reasonable to hold? Sure. I hold certain exclusive beliefs. One of my exclusive beliefs is I need oxygen in order to continue living. Nothing else, math problems, as I said. Exclusive beliefs are always reasonable to hold. Insulin, as I mentioned last night, instead of ice cream. Okay, here's the last one. Pushing beliefs on others is wrong, unless you're, of course, an atheist writing a book, right? Belief in God is a delusion, as Richard Dawkins would say. Religion is a virus, Christopher Hitchens. And it's morally wrong to push religious beliefs on others by expressing them in invocations or other community-centered meetings, like prayer before a city council or cross on a hill or something like that. Which is why atheists seek to push their beliefs of the non-existence of God upon all aspects of society. Have you ever wondered about this? Why are they so dead set on pulling crosses off of hilltops? I had a conversation with a guy who was doing this. In our city, we have a cross on a hill. Land happened to be owned by the city. And the ACLU lawyer wanted to pull the cross off the top of the hill. I have a client who lives in your town who's offended by that. The city can't own that land. It's offensive. Either the cross must go or the city must sell the land. The city actually did sell the hilltop to a private organization, a nonprofit, that was formed in order to keep the cross on the hill. So they formed an organization, then they recontracted with the city to maintain the services. So it's actually a big but here's the deal. The cross is still on the hill. Why is the atheist in the community no longer offended? In other words, if there was a Nazi swastika up on that hill, it wouldn't matter who owned it. It may be particularly egregious if it was the city, but it doesn't matter who owns it. It's the symbol itself that's the offense. It's the message that the symbol communicates. That's what the atheists don't want to admit. What they want is not a separation, they say, of church and state. It's what they want is the elimination of church and any remembrances of it from any aspects of our society. And that's the biggest problem. So there's just 5 points I've given you on how atheist positions contradict themselves. When they're talking about themselves, the same rules don't apply. What does this mean for us? This means that as thoughtful individuals, we should weigh not only our beliefs, but all beliefs. And if we find a contradiction in our view, then we need to reassess what we believe, because chances are the contradiction is pointing out either a mistake in our belief or a misunderstanding of the data from which we've culminated the belief. And that's what we need to do. So let me pray, and then I think we just have a minute for 1 or 2 questions, and then you guys can go to lunch and have a good time. So, Lord, I thank you for this time. I thank you that you are a God who tells us to test all things, to hold fast to the truth, to that which is real, to that which is noble, to that which is logical. Jesus as the logos, as the Greek word for reason, You are the one who displays the truth. You are the way, the truth, and the life. And we thank you, Lord, that we can love you not only with all of our heart and with all of our strength, but with all of our minds as well. We pray that as the day continues, you would bless our time and help us just lift your name on high in all that we meet and all that we share. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Is there one or two questions that I can take real quick, and then we'll dismiss for lunch. I'll have Randy do. Yes, ma'am. That's true. That's true. But when they talk about this, they're trying to model a prebiotic organism, so they're trying to strip it down to its very basic essentials, and they're just hoping that they could get a self-replicating thing. And then once they get a self-replicating thing, then they're going to work on the next bit, which is to get those things to be ensheathed in right. What we see today, you're right. So if you think about it, today, from the evolutionist's point of view, today we see cars driving up and down the road, okay? None of the cars that we see, all of the cars that we see today, usually they all have computer systems in them, right? This is annoying to me because I'm poor and I work on my car. Have you ever tried to work on a car with a computer system? It's brutal. It just is, okay? A Model T is far more simple than, now you never see Model Ts today. So while the cell that you and I see today is very complex, they would argue, we're talking about the Model T, we're talking about the very beginnings of it, so they probably are going to be simpler. I'll concede that to them, but even if it's simpler, it's not so simple that all you have is, lumber and metal, and it all of a sudden forms itself into a car, which is, there's still a huge jump there. But you are right. Today, it's much more complex than that. You need a whole lot more stuff. Yes, ma'am. Inherently known. That may be the case, but what if you're inherently wrong? And that's the problem. What if, because slavery for most of humanity's existence was the norm. I mean, think about it. It was the Greeks and the barbarians, the Muslims and the infidels, right? The Jews and the Gentiles. It was us, and then there was everybody else. And that was the norm. So does that mean that slavery was okay back then because it's inherently, let's face it, I don't have to teach my kids to lie. I don't have to teach my kids to cheat. That comes naturally to them. I have to teach my kids, train my kids to do good. That's unnatural. That's not part of their inner nature. And that's the thing that we find. It is natural for black widows to devour their mates. Oh my gosh, I don't want that. That's not a good thing for me. So just because it's natural doesn't imply that it's right. We could have some wrong natural inclinations. Did you? Oh, okay. Yes, sir. Oh, he's going to be Sally Jesse.
No, I'm just.
It's probably on mute. There it goes.
So, like, the point is basically how to just make Christians aware that atheists like to use tolerance as a ploy to invalidate our beliefs, at the same time replace our beliefs with their beliefs.
Well, no, the primary point is if you're weighing worldviews, Christianity on one hand, atheism on the other hand, atheism has some significant problems in that their worldview is incoherent. So I don't mind you being an atheist, but don't tell me all people are equal. You're stealing that from Christianity. If you're going to be an atheist, you've got to be consistent and say, no, all people are not equal. Don't tell me that there's a right and a wrong. If you're going to be an atheist, you've got to be consistent and say, we have preferences. Maybe we have preferences as cultures, but that doesn't make them objectively right and wrong.
But how I see that influencing like our culture is taking down the Ten Commandments, or
right.
talking about there being what, or not being a difference in genders and whatnot, how their belief is almost an attack on ours, to invalidate ours, to replace it with theirs, to get us to actually to stand up for ours.
That's part of it. I mean, I want to be very careful. The gender issue is not necessarily atheist versus believer. That's a little different, because there can be atheists who hold to the idea of sex is biologically determined and things like that. So I don't want to pin that on an atheist, and I was specifically focusing on atheism. But yes, any worldview will seek to advance itself, because let's face it, everybody believes what they think is true, which is what you should do. You should never say, I know this isn't true, but I'm going to believe it anyway. You don't do that. That's insane. So they would want to advance their cause because they think they're in the right. So yes, that's a natural outcome. One of the ways that we do this is say, well, before you advance that cause, you got to answer some questions and tell me how this works out. So that's my next talk, 5 questions to ask a skeptic. So you can do that one after lunch. Yes, exactly.
It's Lenny, right?
Yes.
As part of your conclusion, you said that as Christians, we should be willing to to recognize contradictions in our beliefs, and to,
Yes.
Be prepared to, reject a problem with our belief, or to reevaluate our understanding. Were you talking about, like, when you said that, were you talking about beliefs that we might hold in general as Christians, or were you talking about faith also?
Both, all of the above. I mean, any belief that you hold should be able to be examined to make sure that it's true. This is what, again, rational people think about even what they hold, and some people change their beliefs over time. Now, there are 2 ways to change a belief that I know of. One is to show a contradiction, like I've done. When a person says, oh, that doesn't make sense, I have to go back and rethink it. Or the other is to give new information. So, for example, if I were to say, in the field across the street, driving over here this morning, I saw a pink elephant. How many of you believe me? Oh, a couple of brave souls. All right. Okay. So, now most of you don't. How about if I said, I'll give you $1 million, I'll write you a check if you believe that I saw a pink elephant down the street? How many of you now believe me? Now, how many of you actually believe it, are not just raising your hand to get the money? There's a difference, right? Okay. It's a hard thing to believe, a live, living pink elephant. But what if I add some more information? What's the percentage of there being a live, living pink elephant across the street? You guys said probably virtually 0. But if I said, not only did I see the pink elephant, I saw 3 trucks marked Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. I saw a big tent go up, and I saw a guy with this huge pancake makeup thing. Now, does that additional information make it more plausible to believe that maybe I actually did see a pink elephant? Changes the odds dramatically, doesn't it? So, giving new information, putting it in a proper context, the worldview that we just heard about last time, can open up ideas of new beliefs. That's why it's important for us to weigh even the beliefs that we have, because something that on its face can seem so contradictory, maybe we don't understand it well enough. Maybe we don't have all the information. Or maybe we believe that something is clear, and then down the road we find out, it's not necessary that this thing be the belief that we hold in order to still be a faithful Christian or something like that. So that's why it is good to challenge ourselves, because we grow that way.
Okay, but I guess your answer addressed more aspects of our faith. Like, my question was more like, what if by my own reasoning I come to the belief that, that Christianity as a whole is not true, that the Bible is not true?
Right.
And I mean, obviously that would be false reasoning, of course.
Not necessarily. Paul put that specific test in the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ is not raised from the dead, he took all of Christianity, hung it on a single thread.
Yeah. Okay.
If Christ is not raised from the dead, you are of all people to be most pitied. You are believers, you're defiant of God, you're believing a lie. You should, there is no resurrection of the dead if Christ is not raised. Therefore, what are we even doing this stuff for? Mm-hmm. So he actually does hang Christianity on that thread. Prove that. And what has happened over the course of time is people have sought to cut that thread. Turns out that thread's made of titanium. So you get guys like Simon Greenleaf, who really established a lot of the jurisprudence, forms of evidence in our legal system, challenged by his students. Take down the resurrection because all of Christianity falls with it. And he looks at it and he comes out a Christian. You have Frank Morrison in the 1940s, newspaper reporter, seeks to crumble Christianity by taking down the resurrection, turns into a Christian. You have Lee Strobel trying to do the same thing in the 70s. J. Warner Wallace investigating it like a cold case to test it. Over and over again, you see people doing this and finds out that they can't break, that this stuff actually stands up as true. So Paul actually even said, yes, as long as you're investigating it fairly, investigate even the core of Christianity. Test all things. Yeah. Hold fast to that which is good.
So to conclude, maybe because this isn't my time, would that be putting faith below reason?
No. Okay, that's a great question. That's a wonderful question. Because faith and reason are not at odds with each other. I have faith because of the evidence, not in spite of it. Faith is not something that you have in spite of evidence. And this is a big misunderstanding. Faith is something you have because of evidence. I have faith in my wife that she will be completely faithful to me. Okay? Why do I have that? Because I know her character. I've been with her for 29 years. I don't have to worry that she's going to try to go out on something. Now, my faith isn't based upon nothing. It's not blind faith. Christians should never have blind faith. That's why you're here today. Your faith is based on your experience, your understanding of who she is, your understanding of how she reacts with others in the world. She has the same faith in me. But that isn't faith, blind faith in spite of evidence. That's faith because we have that kind of evidence. And that's the kind of faith you should have with Christianity. It is a faith built on evidence. This is why Paul starts off by saying in that same chapter, 1 Corinthians, he says, he was seen by Peter, he was seen by the apostles, he was seen by even more than 500 people, some of whom died, but some of whom you can go and ask. Why does he tell us that? Because Christianity has always been embedded in a historic framework. It's a real life thing that happened in real life history that you can then investigate appropriately. Christianity never asks you to believe in spite of evidence. It says, know the character of God, Abraham. You know that God promised you that your son would be resurrected from the dead, or that your son would multiply to the sand of the sea. Therefore, if you sacrifice your son, I'm going to have to resurrect him. So Abraham, a man of faith, takes Isaac up the hill, knowing that it's God's problem, not his, because he knows that sooner or later, Isaac's coming back to him. And that's what he tells his two cohorts. He says, the boy and I will come up, and then we will come back to you, both of us. So Abraham knows the character of God the way I know the character of my wife, and that's the faith that he has. Never blind faith. So, I'm sorry, I'm going long.
You can